Dr. Julian Pryce called her nurse. He didn't look at her face, only at the orthopedic shoes that made a ridiculous squeak-thud on the Mercy General linoleum. He didn't know that the hands currently offering him a chart had once snapped the neck of a sentry in Kandahar. Alara Vance lowered her head, playing the role, the harmless grandmother, the invisible labor, but her ears were hunting. Through the relentless drumming of the rain against the reinforced glass, she was counting. The storm outside wasn't just weather. It was a Sega engine, hammering the city into submission and providing the perfect acoustic cover for an extraction. And the ache in her left knee wasn't just arthritis. It was a biological barometer, screaming that the atmospheric pressure had dropped to critical levels. Something was coming. Pryce brushed past her, the fabric of his expensive lab coat grazing her arm. He was shouting into his phone about a VIP transfer that didn't exist, his voice cracking with the strain of his own ambition. He saw furniture in beige scrubs. He saw a biological system in decline. Alara didn't blink. She shifted her weight to her good leg, watching the pulse in his neck flutter. 110 beats per minute. Rapide, erratic. Stress, incompetence. She looked down at the patient in trauma 2, a homeless man, shivering, his coat smelling of wet wool and decay. His veins were collapsed from years of abuse and the brutal hypothermia of the storm. Pryce had ordered a line, established 10 minutes ago, jabbed twice, and then walked away when he couldn't find a return. He saw Ayunke. Alara saw a mission. She stepped forward, the facility's backup generator humming a low, 60 hertz, warning beneath the floorboards, vibrating through the soles of her shoes. Alara stripped off her gloves and pulled a fresh pair from the box. Snap. The latex was tight, clinical, a second skin. She didn't look at the patient's arm directly. The emergency lighting was too dim, casting long, deceptive shadows. She didn't need eyes. She needed tactile feedback. Her thumb pressed into the cold, clammy skin of the antecubital fossa. Nothing, at first, just scar tissue, hardness, and fluid. She moved lower, tracking the anatomy by memory, her fingers reading the topography of muscle and bone like a map of hostile terrain she had navigated 1,000 times before. There, a faint, rolling resistance beneath the subcutaneous fat. A basilic vein, deep, fragile, but viable. She uncapped the needle. The motion was fluid, a ghost of a different life where hesitation meant a body bag. 15 degrees. She anchored the skin and advanced the needle. A subtle pop transmitted through the plastic hub, a vibration only she could feel. Flashback. The smell of burning diesel and copper. Dark blood filled the chamber. Perfect flow. She taped the line down, her movements efficient, invisible. The patient didn't stir. He wouldn't remember the phantom who saved his circulation. Pryce returned, glancing at the bag of saline hanging perfectly, dripping with a steady rhythm. He grunted, assuming the work had simply done itself, a miracle of the institution rather than the skill of the staff. He never looked at the hands that did the work, only the result. Alara stepped back into the shadows, her hand brushing the pocket of her scrubs where a cheap ballpoint pen sat. She squeezed it once. Hard. Plastic creaked under the pressure of 20 years of discipline. The adrenaline of the procedure faded, leaving the need to scream again. Pain, level, 7 out of 10, and rising. The medial meniscus was inflamed, sending sharp, electrical signals up her thigh. Alara retreated to the medication room, the sanctuary of inventory and silence. She unlocked her locker with a code typed by muscle memory, Inside, a bottle of ibuprofen sat next to a faded photo she no longer looked at. She stared at her own reflection in the metal cabinet. Beige data, she reminded herself. It tells you that you are still alive. And more importantly, it tells you the structural limit of the body before collapse. Ilara shook 2 pills into her palm. She threw them back. Dry swallow. No water. The bitterness on her tongue was grounding. It wasn't comfort. It was maintenance. A necessary chemical intervention to maintain operational capacity. Data updated. She checked the wall clock. 23:52. The rhythm of the ER was wrong. The automatic doors hadn't opened in 40 minutes. No sirens cutting through the storm. No radio chatter. Just the rain. The silence was heavy. Artificial. A bottle episode. But then, the pattern broke. Her ears filtered out the chaos of the wind and locked onto the magnetic locks of the main entrance. Click. 1. Click. 2. Click. 3. The sequence was manual. Someone was overriding the security protocols from the outside, using a bypass key. The rhythm was deliberate. Professional. Ilara's breathing shifted, flattening into a controlled cadence. 4 seconds later, the heavy thud of boots hit the linoleum. Vibram soles. Not the shuffling of patients. The heel-toe impact of tactical boots carrying heavy loads. Dolmen. The air in the corridor shifted, carrying the new scent of wet wool, cold air, and gun oil. The cleanup crew had arrived. Ilara reached into her pocket, fingers bypassing the pen and wrapping around the cold glass of a rogue epinephrine ampule. It wasn't a weapon, but in the right hands, chemistry was just ballistics by other means. She turned to face the door. The door did not open. Not yet. The tactical rhythm Ilara had detected, the heavy, syncopated thud of boots on the perimeter, remained a distant, vibrating threat, currently separated from the ER by 3 layers of drywall and a security door that would hold for exactly 12 seconds against a standard battering ram. She calculated the intercept vector. She had time to move the homeless patient to a hard corner. She had time to kill the lights. But she did not have time for the figure that stepped into her line of sight, blocking the corridor with the maddening, soft-fleshed inertia of a civilian bureaucrat. Dr. Julian Pryce stood under the flickering fluorescent halo of the nursing station, his back to the threat, his attention entirely consumed by the glowing screen of his iPad. He was a soft target in a kill zone, oblivious to the fact that the atmosphere in the room had shifted from medical emergency to tactical siege. Dull Pryce. The silence in the ER wasn't the breath-holding tension of an ambush. It was simply a lack of productivity. He didn't feel the drop in barometric pressure that was making Ilara's knee throb with a dull, sickening ache. He only felt the draft from the HVAC system, which he adjusted by pulling his pristine lab coat tighter. He didn't look up as Ilara approached. He didn't acknowledge the predator lurking in the rain outside. He simply tapped a fingernail against the glass of his tablet. A sharp, annoying tick-tick-tick that competed with the rhythm of the storm. Vance, he said. He didn't use her title. He didn't use her first name. He used her surname like it was a diagnosis code for a chronic, incurable administrative error. Ilara stopped. She forced her body to mimic the posture of submission. Shoulders slumped, head tilted down. The weight shifted off the bad knee to create the illusion of frailty. It was active camouflage. Doctor, she replied, her voice rasping slightly. She kept it flat. Monotone. No threat. Pryce finally sighed. a melodramatic exhalation of air that smelled faintly of peppermint and stale coffee. He gestured vaguely at the digital chart on his screen without turning it to face her. The timestamp on the admission log for the John Doe in Trauma 2, he said, his voice dripping with a forced, patronizing patience. You logged the saline drip at 23:48? The admission protocol wasn't signed until 23:50. He paused, waiting for an apology. When none came, he continued, his eyes scanning the data, searching for another flaw to exploit. It's a billing conflict. Vance. A sequence error. Insurance will kick this back. Risk management will flag it. He used the terms like weapons, risk management, compliance, liability, bludgeoning her with the vocabulary of the institution. Ilara watched him. She overlaid a tactical grid on his anatomy. Target analysis. Pulse elevated. Pupils dilated, not from adrenaline but from the pettiness of his own ego. He was terrified of the audit trail, yet blind to the physical danger marching toward his back. He was prioritizing digital paperwork while the building was being encircled. It was a staggering display of cognitive dissonance. I prioritized the patient's circulation, Ilara said. The paperwork is secondary to the biological reality. The paperwork is the reality, Pryce snapped. For a second, his eyes flickered up, but they didn't land on her face. They landed on the badge clipped to her chest, verifying her ID number, not her humanity. You are an instrument of this hospital, nurse, and instruments must be calibrated. He stepped closer, invading her personal space with the arrogance of a man who had never been punched in the throat. Look at you. He gestured at her shoes, the thick, sensible soles designed to dampen the shock of walking on concrete all day. You're slow. You're drifting. I hear you shuffling down the hall before I see you. Squeak-Thud. Squeak-Thud. It's distracting. It projects incompetence. The insult wasn't about the log. It was about her existence. The invisible wall slammed down between them. He was reducing her to a noise, a broken cog. Inside Ilara's chest, the heart rate didn't spike. It dropped. The ice flooded her system. The urge to reach out, secure his trachea, and drive his face into the laminate counter was a physical pressure, sharp and hot. But the mission required invisibility. The mission required her to be the old woman. Her hand, deep in her pocket, released the epinephrine ampule and closed around the cheap plastic barrel of the ballpoint pen. She squeezed. She channeled the lethal tradecraft of 30 years into the grip strength of her right hand. Crack. The sound was sharp, like a small bone snapping. The plastic shattered, driving shards into her palm. The pain was immediate, sharp, and clarifying. It was a grounding anchor. Pryce didn't hear the pen break. The sound was lost under the drumming of the rain and his own monologue. He tapped the screen one last time, sealing the reprimand in the digital ether. Fix the log, he said, bored now, the dopamine hit of the power trip fading. And then, clock out? I don't want to hear that noise anymore tonight. He turned his back on her, dismissing her as easily as he would delete a spam email. Waddle to your car. Nurse. Try not to slip in the puddles. I can't afford a workers' comp claim on top of a billing audit. Ilara stood motionless. The shards of the pen dug into the calloused skin of her palm. A sacred, bleeding reminder of the discipline that kept him alive. Understood, she whispered. The word was a lie. She wasn't going to her car. She wasn't clocking out. Pryce walked away, his dress shoes clicking on the tiles, heading deeper into the hospital, away from the lobby, away from the safety he thought he controlled. He was walking deeper into the kill box. Elira wiped her hand on the inside of her pocket, leaving a smear of ink and blood on the beige fabric. She turned back toward the dark corridor. The timestamp on the wall clock read 23:55. The ghost was now active. The automatic doors to the ambulance bay didn't just slide open. They were forced. The magnetic locks disengaged with a sound like a gunshot. A heavy, mechanical thud that vibrated through the floorboards and silenced the steady drum of the rain. A gust of wind, carrying the smell of wet asphalt, ozone, and aviation fuel, swept into the sterile lobby, scattering loose papers across the admission desk and sending a chill through the stagnant air. "Doctor," Pryce flinched, dropping his hand from the counter as if burned. He spun around, his face flushing with the indignation of a man whose climate-controlled environment had been breached. But the protest dying in his throat never made it to his lips. The air pressure in the room shifted, dropping instantly as the storm reclaimed the sterile space. 6 figures moved through the rain-slicked opening. They didn't walk. They flowed, clad in wet tactical gear that absorbed the fluorescent light rather than reflecting it. They moved with a synchronized, predatory silence that made the hair on Alara's arms stand up. Water dripped from their ceramic plate carriers, hitting the floor in a rhythm that wasn't random. It was the cadence of a hunting pack. There was no shouting, no sirens, just the heavy, rhythmic impact of Vibram soles on tile and the soft rustle of waterproof fabric. They fanned out, securing the perimeter in 4 seconds flat, turning the civilian lobby into a secured sector. The leader, a mountain of a man with a face carved from granite and eyes that scanned the room like targeting lasers, strode toward the nursing station. He carried a body, a young man, unconscious, pale as milk, his chest heaving with shallow, ragged breaths, draped over his shoulder like a rucksack. Pryce found his voice, shrill and trembling, a thin reed against the storm. "This is a restricted area," he shouted, stepping forward, his lab coat flapping in the draft. "You can't just barge in here with weapons. I am the attending physician, and I demand." The leader didn't break stride. He didn't even look at Pryce. He simply raised one gloved hand, palm out, a gesture of absolute, kinetic dismissal. "Sit down," he rumbled. The voice wasn't loud, but it possessed the subsonic frequency of an approaching tank. It wasn't a request. It was a physics equation, an unstoppable force meeting a very movable object. Pryce. The authority he had wielded like a cudgel 5 minutes ago evaporated instantly. He stumbled back, his legs hitting a waiting room chair, and collapsed into it, mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. He had been negated, erased. The hierarchy of the hospital, attending, resident, nurse had been dismantled and replaced by the hierarchy of violence. The leader bypassed the doctor and stopped directly in front of the counter where Alara stood. The air around him smelled of rain, copper, and the distinct, metallic tang of fresh blood. He looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the gray hair, the orthopedic shoes, the ink stain on her pocket. He saw the invisible woman, and then he did the impossible. The giant stopped. The frenetic energy of the breach slammed into a wall of absolute stillness. He lowered the unconscious man gently onto a gurney that 2 of his team had already secured. Then, turning back to Alara, he reached into a pouch on his vest. His movements were slow, deliberate, ritualistic. He produced a heavy black metal coin. He placed it on the Formica counter, a sharp, Resonant sound cut through the hum of the generator and the drumming rain. It was the sound of a debt coming due. The coin bore the insignia of a hawk with a broken wing, the metal worn smooth at the edges from constant handling, but stained with something that looked suspiciously like dried blood. Alara stared at it. Her breath hitched. The ice in her veins turned to fire. It was the breached hawk, the challenge coin of the shadow unit she had supported in Belgrade, a ghost from a life she had buried. Then, Commander Hax shifted his weight. The Kevlar of his knee pad crunched against the linoleum as he dropped to one knee. The room seemed to tilt. Dr. Pryce, watching from his chair, looked as if he were hallucinating. A Navy SEAL commander was kneeling on the dirty floor of a civilian ER in front of a 56-year-old nurse. Hax bowed his head, exposing the vulnerability of his neck, a gesture of supreme submission. When he looked up, his eyes were wet, filled with a desperate, terrifying hope. "We are compromised, ma'am," Hax said, his voice rough with smoke and exhaustion. He didn't speak to her as a civilian. He spoke to her as a superior officer. "The safe house is gone. The protocols are burned." He gestured to the boy on the gurney, then back to her, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that burned. "We need the Valkyrie." Trauma 1 was a slaughterhouse of white light and red noise. The monitors were screaming a cacophony of alarms signaling hypovolemic shock and impending cardiac arrest. Echo, the boy on the table, was a map of devastation. His skin was translucent, blue-veined, stretching tight over ribs that didn't rise evenly. A sucking chest wound on the right side bubbled with pink froth, a gruesome whistle accompanying every desperate gasp for air. The smell of copper and bowel hung heavy in the air, mixing with the sharp scent of antiseptic. "Get a line in. 2 large bore, 18 gauge, Alara barked. Her voice had changed. The rasp of the tired nurse was gone, replaced by the sharp, percussive snap of command. She moved with a frightening economy of motion, stripping packaging from IV kits without looking. Pryce was in the corner, near the sink. He was useless. He had taken one look at the carnage, the sheer volume of blood soaking the sheets and dripping onto the floor in turn the color of old ash. He wretched, gripping the porcelain basin, his expensive education failing him in the face of raw, kinetic violence. He was a theoretical doctor. This was practical butchery. Alara ignored him. She was already moving, her hands flying over the instrument tray. Scalpel, rib spreader, clamps. "Hax, hold him down," she ordered. The commander moved instantly, pinning the boy's shoulders with the weight of a hydraulic press. "No anesthesia?" Alara said, her eyes fixed on the bubbling wound. "BP is 60/40. If we push meds, he bottoms out and dies. I have to go in cold." She didn't wait for permission. She slashed the scalpel across the intercostal space between the 4th and 5th ribs. Skin parted, muscle separated, blood dark, venous, sluggish, welled up, coating her gloves in slick warmth. She didn't flinch. Pain is data, she thought, but this wasn't her pain. It was the price of the boy's survival. She jammed the rib spreader into the incision and cranked. Crack. The sound of bone giving way was wet and sickening, like snapping a green branch. Pryce heaved again in the corner, the sound lost under the rhythm of the ventilator. Alara plunged her gloved hands into the chest cavity. The heat was shocking, a visceral reminder of the life fighting to stay inside. She was working blind again, navigating by the tactile map of anatomy. Her fingers brushed the slick surface of the lung, feeling the ragged tear where the air was escaping. She clamped the bleeder. The monitor's tone shifted, slightly less frantic, but there was something else. Her fingertips grazed. Something hard lodged against the pericardium. Metal, jagged, the foreign object that had torn through the boy's life. "Got it," she whispered. With a pair of long forceps, she reached in, maneuvering around the beating heart. It was a delicate, terrifying dance. One slip, and she would nick the aorta, ending the mission before it began. She held her breath. The world narrowed down to the tips of the steel instrument. She clamped down and pulled. The metal clattered into the stainless steel kidney basin. Cling clang. Alara stared at it. Under the harsh surgical lights, the object gleamed. It wasn't a jagged piece of shrapnel from a roadside bomb. It wasn't a deformed slug from a terrorist's AK-47. It was a bullet. A pristine, copper-jacketed projectile. The deformation was minimal, suggesting high velocity and specific manufacturing. She leaned closer, her eyes narrowing behind her glasses. She froze. The world stopped. 5.5 to 6 millimeter. It was NATO standard. The crimping on the casing base, the specific alloy of the jacket, she knew this round. She had loaded thousands of them. The agency used these. Hax's team used these. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Colder than the rain outside? This wasn't an enemy ambush. This was friendly fire. Or worse, it was a purge. The people who were supposed to be the cavalry were the ones pulling the trigger. She looked up at Hax. The commander was focused on the boy's face, wiping sweat from Echo's forehead with a tenderness that belied his size. He didn't look at the basin. He didn't know. Ilara's hand moved. Fast, invisible. Before Pryce could turn around, before Hax could shift his gaze, she scooped the bullet from the basin and closed her fist around it. She shoved it deep into her pocket, next to the shards of the broken pen. Suture him up, she said, her voice hollow. He's stable. She looked at the boy, then at Hax, and finally at the darkness pressing against the windows. The threat wasn't just outside. It was in the room. It was in the caliber. The war hadn't just followed them home. It had been brought here by their own people. The hospital was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage. The lights didn't flicker. They died. 1 second, the trauma bay was bathed in the harsh stereo of halogens, illuminating the arterial spray on Ilara's gloves. The next, the world collapsed into a suffocating, heavy blackness. The ventilators hiccuped, their rhythmic whoosh click, faltering for a heartbeat before the backup batteries kicked in with a low, desperate whine. Then, the emergency lighting engaged. It wasn't white. It was a deep, saturated crimson. The room was instantly transformed from a hospital into a developing tray, the blood on the floor, looking black under the red wash. Power failure? Pryce's voice was high, trembling, coming from the shadows near the sink. The storm must have hit the main grid. I need to call maintenance. No, Ilara said. Her voice was flat, devoid of hope. It's not the storm. Is Asif Onkwe. The overhead PA system crackled to life. It wasn't the usual static-filled channel used for paging doctors. It was a pre-recorded, digital voice, smooth and terrifyingly calm. Biocontainment protocol level 4 active. Facility locked down. External ventilation sealed. Do not exit. Do not attempt to override. This is for your safety. Ilara stood still, her mind racing. Biocontainment level 4. It was the bottle episode protocol. It sealed the hospital hermetically to prevent the spread of a pathogen, but it also did something else. It legally barred local law enforcement from entering without federal clearance. It turned the building into a sovereign dead zone. The police weren't coming. No one was coming. Silas Vane had just locked the door and swallowed the key. They're isolating us, Hax growled, his hand instinctively going to his sidearm. They're cutting off our extraction. Ilara looked at the bullet in her pocket, its weight heavy against her thigh. She looked at Echo, stable but vulnerable. And then she looked at her own leg. The adrenaline from the surgery was fading, and the ice was melting, revealing the jagged, screaming reality of her knee. Pain level 8 out of 10. mobility compromised. If she couldn't move, she couldn't fight. And if she couldn't fight, they were all dead. She limped to the crash cart, her movements jerky, mechanical. She ignored Pryce, who was tapping frantically on his dead cell phone. She opened the drawer labeled corticosteroids. She bypassed the standard vials and reached for the high-concentration methylprednisolone. She didn't bother with a numbing agent. There was no time. Alara rolled up her scrub pant leg, exposing the swollen, angry joint. She swabbed a spot with alcohol. The cold bite was a warning. She uncapped the syringe. Hax watched her, his eyes narrowing. He recognized the look. It was the look of a soldier checking their gear before a suicide mission. She drove the needle into the joint space. The pain was blinding, a white-hot spike that made her vision gray out for a second. It felt like a nail being driven into the bone. She didn't scream. She didn't gasp. She just exhaled a sharp, hissing breath through her teeth, forcing the plunger down. Buenas data, she repeated, the mantra fraying at the edges. Accept the data. Process it. Discard it. She withdrew the needle and tossed it into the sharp spin. The relief wouldn't be immediate, but the inflammation would subside enough to let her walk. Enough to let her kill. Doctor, Alara said, turning to Pryce. He looked up, startled by the sudden hardness in her tone. Stay with the patient. If his vitals drop, bag him. Do not leave this room. Where are you going? Pryce whispered, the red light making him look like a ghost. Alara didn't answer. She walked past Hax, toward the door. As she passed the security guard station in the hall, empty now, save for a pool of blood and a fallen radio, she stopped. Lying in the shadow of the desk was a Glock 17, discarded or dropped. She picked it up. She dropped the magazine. Full. She checked the chamber. Loaded. Click-clack. The sound was crisp, lethal. She slid the weapon into the waistband of her scrubs. It felt cold against her skin. I'm going to MRI, she said to the darkness. I need to turn on the magnet. And the radiology department was a tomb. The red emergency lights didn't reach here. The corridor was a long throat of absolute darkness, broken only by the faint, rhythmic strobe of a failing exit sign at the far end. Alara moved through the gloom, her footsteps silenced by the roll of thunder outside. The cortisone was working a dull, chemical heat masking the structural failure of her knee, but she still kept her weight on her right side, moving with the deceptive shuffle of a janitor. She reached the MRI suite. The door was heavy, shielded with copper to block RF interference. She pushed it open. The room inside was cavernous, dominated by the massive, cylindrical bulk of the 3 Tesla scanner. It was dormant, a sleeping giant of supercooled helium and copper wire. But it wasn't dead. The quench pipe venting system was active, and the console in the control room was still drawing power from the critical circuit. Alara moved to the control room, separated from the scanner by a pane of wire mesh glass. She didn't turn on the lights. She worked by tactile memory, her fingers finding the sequence on the console. Power up. Field ramp. Shim coils active. A low sound began to fill the room. Thrum, thrum, thrum. It started as a vibration in the floor. Subsonic. Felt in the teeth rather than heard. Then it grew. A rising mechanical moan that deepened into a steady, menacing hum. The magnetic field was building. Invisible lines of force were expanding outward, turning the room into a trap. It wasn't a weapon that fired bullets. It was a singularity. Alara slipped back into the scanner room. She didn't hide behind the machine. She stood in the open, near the door, a piece of bait in beige scrubs. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the broken pen. She tossed it onto the floor, near the center of the room. Then, she waited. 30 seconds later, the door creaked. A shadow detached itself from the hallway darkness. Silas Swane. He moved like smoke, his silhouette broken up by tactical gear. He wore night vision goggles, quad tubes, that gave him a predator's view of the dark. In his hands, he held a suppressed carbine, short-barreled. Efficient. He scanned the room, his head moving with robotic precision. He saw Alara. He didn't hesitate. He raised the weapon. "Nurse," he said. His voice was a flat, metallic rasp, distorted by a comms mask. "Step away from the wall." Alara didn't move. She looked at the gun. Steel receiver. Steel bolt carrier group. Steel barrel. She looked at his face. The battery pack for the NVGs on his helmet. Rare earth magnets in the headset. She calculated the distance. He was 6 feet past the warning line. He was inside the 500 Gauss perimeter. "You're late," she said. And then she hit the scan button on the remote console she had palmed. The machine didn't just hum. It screamed. The gradient coils fired, pulsing the magnetic field with the force of a car crash. The invisible giant woke up and grabbed. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The carbine in Silas's hands was ripped upward, not as if pulled by a string, but as if gravity had suddenly rotated 90 degrees. The strap bit into his neck, jerking him forward off his feet. He slammed into the side of the scanner with a bone-jarring crunch. Sparks flew blue and white as the steel of the weapon ground against the fiberglass housing of the magnet. The NVGs were torn from his face, the mounting bracket shearing off his helmet with a screech of tearing metal. They slapped against the bore of the machine, sticking there like iron filings to a toy magnet. Silas was pinned. The rifle was crushing his windpipe, the sling pulling tight, strangling him. He was a bug on a windshield. But he didn't panic. He didn't thrash. His hands flew to his chest, finding the trauma shears in his vest. Snip. The sling parted. He dropped to the floor, gasping, rubbing his bruised throat. The rifle remained stuck to the machine, vibrating with the magnetic flux. He rolled, coming up in a crouch, one hand clutching his chest where the impact had likely cracked a rib. He looked at Alara. No anger, no fear, just a cold, recalibrating assessment. He was hurt, disarmed, and blind in the dark, but he was alive. Tradecraft, he wheezed. The word, a grudging admission of respect. He backed away, moving carefully out of the field's pull, his eyes never leaving her. Smart. Alara stood by the glass, her hand trembling slightly. It wasn't fear. It was the adrenaline dump. She had hurt him, but she hadn't stopped him. And now, the eraser knew exactly what kind of game they were playing. Silas Vane didn't stay to chat. He had retreated into the labyrinth of the radiology department, a wounded apex predator melting into the shadows with the terrifying discipline of a man who viewed pain as mere information. Alara didn't pursue. She couldn't. Her knee was throbbing, a deep, bone-level ache that the cortisone was only just beginning to mute. The drug was a chemical promise, et not un miracle. It masked the signal, but the structural failure remained. She needed intel, not a foot race. She moved in the opposite direction, favoring her right leg, her breath hitching with every step. She navigated the dark corridors toward the central pharmacy supply closet, a reinforced concrete box designed to secure narcotics but now serving as her only viable bunker. Inside, the air was stagnant and heavy, smelling of isopropyl alcohol, cardboard, and the faint, sweet dust of pulverized pills. Alara locked the heavy door behind her click-thud and slid down to the cool linoleum floor, her back resting against a metal shelf stacked with saline bags. The cold seeped through her scrubs, a stark contrast to the feverish heat radiating from her knee. She pulled the handheld radio she had taken from the dead guard out of her pocket. It was a digital model, encrypted, heavy in her hand. Silas's team was using a tactical override channel to coordinate their sweep, arrogant in their belief that the hospital's comms were secure. Alara turned the volume knob, pressing the speaker against her ear, closing her eyes to filter out the visual noise. Static hissed, a white noise ocean. Then, a voice cut through the interference. It wasn't the metallic, damaged rasp of Silas Vane. It was cleaner, colder, modulated by expensive hardware. A command frequency from outside the net. Status report. Eraser. The voice demanded. It was the voice of a man, sitting in an air-conditioned room thousands of miles away, viewing this bloodshed as a spreadsheet anomaly. Asset located. Silas replied. His voice was tight, strained, likely from the bruising on his crushed windpipe. But we have a complication. The nurse is problematic. She's armed. She knows the layout, and she has engaged kinetic traps. Does she know the payload? The command voice asked, skipping over the human cost. Negative. She's just a civilian obstacle. A glitch. I'm neutralizing. There was a pause. Allons. Heavy silence filled with the weight of decisions made by people who would never smell the blood they spilled. The static swelled and receded. Change of plans? The command voice said, devoid of emotion. The asset is compromised. If he's been treated by local staff, the chain of custody is broken. We can't risk a leak about Kandahar. Liquidate all assets. No loose ends. Burn the site. Elle era frozen. The radio felt like a block of ice against her ear. Liquidate all assets. The phrase hung in the chemical air. That didn't just mean echo. That meant hacks. That meant Pryce. That meant every witness in the building, including her. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the 5.5 to 6 millimeter bullet she had extracted from Echo's chest. She rolled the copper-jacketed slug between her fingers, feeling the cold reality of it. The agency wasn't just cleaning up a loose end. They were erasing an entire operation. The friendly fire wasn't an accident or a mistake in the fog of war. It was policy. Hax and his team thought they were being rescued. They were fighting to hold the line for a cavalry that was coming to execute them. Alara closed her eyes. The realization wasn't a shock. It was a confirmation of everything she had tried to forget about the world she used to inhabit. A heavy, settling weight in her gut replaced the fear. She had spent 30 years serving a system that viewed loyalty as a depreciating asset and human lives as disposable capital. Target fixation. She thought, the term rising from the depths of her training. They are so focused on the breach, they don't see the rot in the foundation. They assumed she was just a nurse, just a pair of hands. She opened her eyes. The fear was gone, burned away by a cold, crystalline clarity. She couldn't save her career, She couldn't save her pension. She couldn't even save her life. Most likely. But she could make sure the erasure wasn't clean. She could be the glitch that crashed their system. She pushed herself up, her knee protesting with a sharp spike of pain, but holding under the weight. The nurse was dead. The Kestrel was active. The second-floor hallway was a tunnel of shadows, elongated and twisted by the red emergency lights that pulsed like a dying heart. Elara moved with the silence of a ghost, hugging the wall to favor her bad leg, her orthopedic shoes absorbing the sound of her advance. She had acquired a suppressor from the armory locker in the security station, the thread-on can that wouldn't truly silence the shot, but would mask the muzzle flash and confuse the acoustics in the confined space. The air here was colder, carrying the draft from the storm outside, mixing with the sterile scent of floor wax. She stopped at the corner junction, peering around the edge of a crash cart. 30 meters down the hall, near the intersection leading to the east wing, Silas Vane stood. He wasn't alone. He had Dr. Pryce. Pryce was on his knees, his posture broken. His expensive lab coat was ruined, stained with sweat, grime, and the filth of the floor. He was weeping, a soft, pathetic sound that grated on the nerves, the sound of a man whose entire world view of order and hierarchy had been shattered by violence. Silas stood behind him, a dark silhouette against the red gloom, the barrel of his sidearm pressed casually but firmly against the base of the doctor's skull. Thus, Silas's voice boomed down the corridor, amplified by the hollow acoustics of the empty hospital. I know you're listening. Come out. The game is over. Elara didn't move. She leaned against the wall, stabilizing her breathing, counting her heart rate. She checked the chamber of the Glock by tactile feel. Loaded. I have your colleague, Silas continued, his voice bored. Professional. He's begging. Vance. He's telling me everything about your little personnel file, about the disciplinary records, about the arthritis. He thinks if he talks enough, I'll let him go. Silas chuckled, a dry, humorless sound that sounded like grinding stones. Come out, and I make it quick for him. Stay hidden, and I make it a lesson in anatomy. I start with the kneecaps. You know how that feels, don't you? It was a classic dilemma. The hostage trade. Leverage the target's humanity against their tactical advantage. But Elara knew the math. If she showed herself, they both died. If she stayed hidden, Pryce died. The equation was balanced on a razor's edge. She needed a third variable to disrupt the calculation. She pulled out her phone, the screen brightness turned down to the minimum. She had accessed the hospital's internal PA system via the admin app, a backdoor she had discovered years ago to mute annoying paging announcements during her night shifts. Her thumb hovered over the pre-recorded sound files for the pediatrics ward. Soothing lullaby. White noise. Crying infant. She selected crying infant. She routed the audio output to the speakers in the far east wing, directly behind Silas's position. She hit play. The sound erupted from the darkness behind Silas, a thin, high-pitched, wailing cry of a newborn. In the dead silence of the lockdown, evacuated hospital, it was terrifying. It echoed, bouncing off the tile, sounding ghostly, impossible, and utterly wrong. It was a sound that triggered a primal instinct, even in Akela. Silas flinched. It was a micro-movement, a twitch of muscle memory. He spun around, his weapon leaving Pryce's head for a fraction of a second as he aimed at the darkness behind him. Check that, he barked to the empty air, assuming his team was close. But he was alone. The distraction had opened the window. Alara stepped out from the corner. She didn't aim for the head. It was too small a target at this distance with iron sights and a knee that was vibrating with pain. She aimed for the center of mass of the shoulder holding the gun. She exhaled, emptying her lungs to steady her hands. Foot. The suppressed shot was a dull cough, swallowed by the hallway. The slide cycled. The brass casing tinkled on the floor like a dropped coin. Silas jerked violently as the round took him in the right deltoid. The impact spun him around. His gun hand spasmed, the nerves severed or shocked, and the weapon clattered to the floor. He roared, a sound of fury rather than pain, grabbing his shattered shoulder and spinning back toward her. But Alara was already moving, retreating back into the shadows of the cross corridor. Pryce scrambled away on hands and knees, sobbing, crawling toward the nearest open door like a frightened animal, slipping in his own sweat. That was a warning. Silas. Ilara's voice echoed from the dark, cold and disembodied, bouncing off the walls so he couldn't pinpoint her source. Next one is the femoral artery. You bleed out in 3 minutes. Leave the doctor. Come for me. The HVAC maintenance room was a claustrophobic box of poured concrete and galvanized steel, buried deep within the mechanical bowels of the hospital's sub-basement. It hummed with the deafening, bone-rattling roar of industrial air handlers, a sound that vibrated through the soles of Alara's shoes and masked the pounding of her own heart. The air here was thick, recycled, and hot, smelling of heated dust, ozone, graphite grease, and the copper tang of hydraulic fluid. The temperature was stifling, a stark, sweltering contrast to the storm-chilled corridors of the ER above. Alara locked the heavy fire door behind her click-thud, securing her sanctuary. She leaned against the metal frame for a fraction of a second, allowing her knee to scream. The cortisone was holding the inflammation at bay, but the structural damage was screaming through the chemical blockade. She forced herself off the door. She wasn't just hiding. She was preparing the kill box. She moved to the central mixing manifold, the arterial heart of the ventilation system that fed the sterile supply corridors of the East Wing. Her movements were jerky, limited by the searing pain, but her hands remained steady. Tremors are a luxury, she told herself. Precision is a requirement. On the scarred metal workbench, she laid out her scavenged arsenal with the reverence of a priest setting an altar. Materials collected from the pharmacy's secure storage, including potent analgesics and neuromuscular blocking agents, the kind used for rapid sequence intubation. She also had a high-volume nebulizer canister she had ripped from a respiratory therapy cart. She began the preparation. It wasn't cooking. It was chemistry. She combined the agents in the canister, creating a cocktail of silence. The specific combination was designed to overload opioid receptors and bind to nicotinic receptors at the neuromuscular junction. The result would be a victim who was fully conscious but trapped in a body that refused to process the command to breathe. It was a cruel, terrifying death. It was exactly what Silas Vane deserved. She secured the canister to the intake valve of the East Wing's air handler. She checked the pressure gauge. Green. The system was sealed. She reached for the bypass valve. Her hand hovered. This was the point of no return. She turned it. Hiss. The sound was sharp, sibilant, like a viper striking in the dark. The aerosolized agent was sucked into the ducts, traveling at 40 feet per second toward the corridor where Silas Vane was hunting. Alara stepped back. Her job done. She wiped her hands on her scrubs, Removing the imaginary residue of the act, she moved to the observation window, a small rectangle of wire-reinforced glass set into the fire door. She waited. 2 minutes later, the shadow appeared in the corridor outside. Silas Vane. He was moving slower now, his tactical fluidity compromised by the bullet wound in his shoulder. He had donned a gas mask, a sleek, black M50 unit expecting tear gas or smoke. He was a professional. He didn't trust the air. Smart. But he didn't know about the physics of the suspension she had engineered. The standard military filters were rated for biological agents and crowd control irritants, not for this specific pharmaceutical mist delivered at close range in a confined space. The particle size would bypass the filtration substrate. He stopped. He staggered. The reaction was almost immediate. He reached for his throat, his gloved fingers clawing at the rubber seal of his mask, trying to tear away the very thing he thought was saving him. The paralysis was hitting his system, shutting down the transmission of nerve signals. His knees buckled. He dropped to the floor, not in a controlled tactical descent, but with the heavy, uncoordinated collapse of dead weight. His carbine clattered away, sliding across the linoleum. He tried to inhale. Ilara could see his chest heaving, a desperate, primal convulsions as his intercostal muscles locked up. He was drowning on dry land, his lungs full of air he couldn't cycle. Ilara watched. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply observed the physiology of dying. It was a clinical audit. She watched his hands spasm the fencing response of a brain starved of oxygen and then go still. She watched his body fight for oxygen it couldn't process. And finally, she watched his eyes. The pupils, visible through the polycarbonate lens of the mask, constricted to pinpoints the undeniable hallmark of opioid overdose. Then, slowly, terrifyingly, they dilated, fixed and staring at the ceiling tiles. The light went out. The eraser was erased. Ilara leaned her forehead against the cool glass, her breath fogging the surface. The adrenaline drained away, leaving only the exhaustion and the pain. Vital signs negative. She whispered to the empty, roaring room. Patient expired. 3 months later, the autumn sun was a pale, cold disk hanging low over the city park, offering light but very little heat. The wind stripped the trees bare, sending leaves the color of dried blood and old gold skittering across the concrete paths with a dry, scratching sound. Ilara sat on a wooden bench near the duck pond, her orthopedic shoes resting heavily on the gravel. She wore a thick beige coat that swallowed her frame, looking every inch the retiree watching the world go by. In her lap, a half-finished scarf of gray wool grew steadily, the metal knitting needles clicking in a soft, rhythmic cadence. Click, 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 click. It was a peaceful sound, a domestic camouflage hiding the fact that her hands calloused, scared, and steady were just as capable of ending a life as they were of creating warmth. She didn't look up when the man approached. She didn't have to. She felt the displacement of the air, the heavy, deliberate tread of someone who walked with a purpose but carried a burden. The step drag of a permanent limp. It was the gait of a survivor. He stopped at the other end of the bench, maintaining a respectful distance. Comment des hex. He wasn't wearing a uniform. The medals, the rank, the insignia all stripped away. He wore a thick navy pea coat and dark jeans, blending into the crowd of civilians, walking their dogs and pushing strollers. But the stillness was there. the predator's vigilance that never truly slept. He looked older, the lines around his eyes etched deeper by the fire of that night. He didn't speak. He didn't say, "Thank you for saving my life." He didn't say, "I'm sorry we were the targets." Words were for civilians. Words were messy, imprecise, and liable to be recorded. Instead, he reached into his deep coat pocket. The movement was slow, televised, non-threatening. He pulled out a small, wrapped bundle of yarn, a skein of deep, midnight blue. He placed it on the bench between them. The object sat there, heavy and incongruous against the weathered wood. Hax stood there for a moment longer, looking out at the ducks fighting over breadcrumbs on the freezing water. He took a breath, the cold air turning it into a plume of white steam. He looked at the skyline. Then, briefly, at her. He didn't smile. He simply nodded once, a sharp, crisp dip of the chin that carried more weight than 1,000 eulogies. Then he turned and walked away, his hands deep in his pockets. Of his limp, a permanent testament to the night the hospital became a kill box. Alara waited until his footsteps faded into the city noise, merging with the traffic and the wind. She put down her needles, breaking the rhythm. She picked up the blue yarn. It was heavier than wool should be. She unwound the outer layer, her fingers brushing the soft fiber. Inside, nestled in the wool like a pearl in an oyster, were two objects. The first was a new ID card, a high-quality forgery, or perhaps a legitimate issue from a ghost department. A passport photo of a woman with gray hair and glasses, looking harmless, but with a different name. A new life. A clean slate. The agency's way of saying, "You don't exist, but we owe you." The second object was metal. Heavy. Warm to the touch from Hax's pocket. It was the challenge coin he had placed on the nursing station counter that night. But the blood was gone. The scorched carbon from the fire was gone. The black matte finish had been polished until it gleamed like dark obsidian. The hawk with the broken wing was still there, but now it looked less like a victim and more like a survivor. It was a badge of honor for a war that never happened. Alara ran her thumb over the raised metal relief. She felt the weight of it, the weight of the lives she had taken, the lives she had saved, and the silence she now carried. She smiled, a small, private expression that didn't reach her eyes. She slipped the coin into her coat pocket, where it clinked softly against her keys. She picked up her needles. The gray wool and the blue wool would make a good pattern. Interwoven. Indivisible. She was just an old woman knitting in the park as the winter approached. But if you looked closely, if you really looked, you would see that her eyes were not on her knitting. They were scanning the perimeter, tracking the exits, watching the shadows. The nurse was retired. The Kestrel was watching